dr Lei Ganor.
The webinarium of the Dr. Lea Ganor.
Organizatorami wydarzenia dzisiejszego
Organizers of today's meeting
jest Regionalny Ośrodek Debaty Międzynarodowej w Gorzowie.
Is Regional Center of Debate.
Wydział Administracji i Bezpieczeństwa Narodowego.
And the Department of National Security.
Nasze spotkanie poprzedziła wizyta pani doktor na naszej uczelni.
Our meeting was preceded by the visit of Dr. Lea Ganor at our academy.
I zakładamy, że jest to początek współpracy pomiędzy dwoma narodami.
And we assume that this is the beginning of the cooperation between our nations.
Ale też współpracy badawczej pomiędzy uniwersytetami.
And also the research work between our universities.
Pozwolę sobie teraz oddać głos panu profesorowi Bogusławowi Jakusiakowi.
I would like to give the floor to the professor.
Kierownikowi Zakładu Bezpieczeństwa Narodowego. Bardzo proszę, panie profesorze.
The director of the Department of National Security.
Bardzo dziękuję pani doktor za udzielenie mi głosu. Szanowni Państwo, a przede wszystkim szanowna pani doktor, dzisiejsza nasza prelegentko.
Our dear guest.
Nasza uczelnia w tym roku ma 5-lecie powstania jako akademia.
Our academy celebrates its 5th anniversary as such.
W stosunku do nauki jest to mało, ale rokuje to dużo na przyszłość.
It is not so much in relation to the learning, but it has the prospect to the future.
Tak jak wspomniała już pani doktor Lubimow, prodziekan do spraw naukowych.
As the Dr. Lubimow mentioned,
życzymy, aby to spotkanie było zaczynem dalszych kolejnych spotkań.
We would like this meeting be the beginning of the further meetings.
Aby było zaczynem dalszych wspólnych projektów badawczych.
Be the beginning of the future research projects.
Aby było zaczynem dobrej, merytorycznej współpracy naukowej.
To be the beginning of the good research and scientific work.
Tego życzę dzisiaj pani doktor i wszystkim uczestnikom.
I wish this to the Dr. Ganor and our participants.
Bowiem dzisiejsza nauka jest nauką interdyscyplinarną.
Today's teaching and learning is interdisciplinary.
Więc wymaga współpracy na wielu płaszczyznach.
And it requires the cooperation at many levels.
I ta współpraca dzisiaj ma swój początek.
And this meeting, this webinar is the beginning of such cooperation.
Dziękujemy jako kierownictwo wydziału.
Thank you for our department.
Za przyjęcie zaproszenia i za seminarium.
For accepting our meeting and for this webinar.
Życzę Państwu samych najlepszych odkryć naukowych i dziękuję bardzo.
I wish you all the best scientific research and thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie profesorze. Jeszcze tylko krótka informacja dla słuchaczy, którzy nie są anglojęzyczni, dla naszych słuchaczy i studentów, którzy mieliby wątpliwość co do znajomości języka. Będziecie Państwo na czacie mieli wklejony link, który pozwoli każdemu ze zrozumieniem wysłuchać wykładu. Seminarium będzie w języku angielskim, więc proszę sięgnąć na czat. Tam będzie przekierowanie do tłumaczenia. Serdecznie zapraszam, Leo.
Thank you very much. I am privileged to be here and happy to be here. Dobry wieczór. Ja jestem bardzo zadowolona być tutaj. No, moja lekcja będzie na angielsku i nie po polsku. So I will share my presentation and I would like to start. My presentation and lecture deals with like a phoenix from the ashes, the life story of the member of the Israeli Air Force, IAF, flight air crew who survived the Holocaust. In the mid-50s, approximately 300 aircrew members served at key points of decision-making within the Israeli Air Force. IAF included 136 Holocaust survivors. 33% of the 285 aircrew members who took part in the 1956 Sinai War were Holocaust survivors. I would like to mention too that between July and December 1948, during the Independence War, there were flight schools in Italy, Czechoslovakia, and South Africa. Some Holocaust survivors with numbers tattooed on their arms joined to the courses in Italy and Czechoslovakia with Jews from Israel who at the time were staying in Italy. I would like to give an example. We remained silent. I kept my personal story close to my chest, like a card. I didn't share it with anyone. It's known that I'm not the only one who kept quiet. The entire amazing group kept quiet, some more than others. Everyone felt foreign to the Israeli way of life, and everyone made a great effort to forget the past, to be like their friends, and to blend into the Israeliness. Some succeeded and some failed. In the early decades after statehood, Pilot considered model of Zionist Sabra heroism. Sabra, it means natives who were born in Israel. The image was reinforced after 1956 war. This war was the first war in which jet planes participated and Air Force played a crucial role in the war. Against the background of a shortage of manpower in the late 50s, Ezer Weizmann, Air Force commander at that time and later president of the State of Israel, coined the phrase, "The best go to the skies." No one mentioned that the fact that approximately 1/3 of the pilots who took part in the fighting were Holocaust survivors. They were called conquerors of the skies in the daily press, and the daily press called them heroes. For example, we were aware of the edge, the best to the skies, and accepted it with understanding. What was the stuff that Israeli pilots were made of? It is their spirit, and they all share it, a sense of mission. Ruth Bondi was a journalist, and she wrote it in 1967. Ruth Bondi was a Holocaust survivor. Even she, that she was a Holocaust survivor, did not mention the fact that approximately 1/3 of the pilots who took part in the fighting were Holocaust survivors. In their late 70s and 80s, some members of the group began sharing memories of their personal experiences during the Holocaust and after the war. I had the privilege to interview 35 members of this group, of this special group, aircrew members, all of whom were born between 1927 and 1942 and experienced the horrors of the Holocaust as children. I have the privilege that one of those children is sitting with us now and hears my lecture, and maybe after he can add something to my lecture. He was a child in the Warsaw Ghetto. His father was murdered in Katyn, and he became a pilot in the Israeli Air Force. So Giora, I'm happy that you are with us. After the war, these individuals faced with many challenges, including difficulties being absorbed into society in their new country. All of them volunteered for the Air Force and served during the 50s and the 60s. Many members of this group, which is part of the legacy of the IAF and the State of Israel, link their decision to be pilot to their experience in the Holocaust. To understand their transformation from exilic children and Holocaust refugees, and to the antithesis to the image of the Sabra fighter into members of the leading elite in the Air Force and the State of Israel. For this, I analyzed the major themes that emerged in the memories they shared during their interviews in historical, social, and cultural context. It's an interdisciplinary research. This analysis, as I mentioned, is based on 35 stories of the interviewees and the Israeli national story. Both reflect the Holocaust and the personal and national rebirth of each of the interviewees and their changing consciousness over the years. Like a jigsaw puzzle, the different stories produce a whole story and a complex account of the phenomenon. So, the methodological discussion considers a number of questions. What was the faith of these children during the following and after the Holocaust? How did their faith during the Holocaust influence their desire to enlist, especially in the Air Force, and their motivation to volunteer for pilot training? What were the factors that contribute to their integration and success in the IAF in Israeli society? So we can see here some of my findings, of course, country of birth, and you can see numbers of interviewees in each country, and year of birth, number of interviewees. I found out that the year of birth was a main factor in their success, and also it depends on the country from where they came, because we know all that the people from Poland was the Nazis invaded to Poland in 1939, so everything started in 1939. But those who were in Hungary, you know that their history, of course, with sending them to the concentration camp, it was 1944. So it depends in which country they were. So the story has, you know, the typical story is typical to the country that they came from. So it's important to emphasize, of course, the difficulties of such a research, methodological difficulties. But before that, I would like to emphasize also to see that you will see the year when the Aliyah, it means when they came to the State of Israel. And of course, the State of Israel was established in 1948, but you can see that one came in 1940. How he came to, it was before the State of Israel was established, the British mandate ruled here. So it's another lecture, how he came in 1940. But what also I would like to emphasize the position. You can see that we have many that were fighter pilot, and you see different kind of positions in the Air Force. Testimonies taken directly from survivors raises question of the reliability of memories conveyed decades after the event themselves. After all, memory has the potential to disappoint. This study focuses on the memories and view of the survivors. The interviews were accompanied by fear regarding the opening of age-old wounds and the concern that perhaps it would be better to leave the past in the past. Other challenges resulted from my desire to preserve the uniqueness of each story, while at the same time creating a common narrative. For this reason, I decided to present the life stories through a discussion based on the main content question that were asked in the interview, and to both characterize the main themes and highlight the themes that are expansional. And also, a few had, from the interviews, a few had trouble defining themselves as Holocaust survivors because they had not been in concentration camp, but rather in quotation. Yes, I'm doing quotation. Only hiding, they fled or made their way to countries such as Bulgaria or Romania. But today we know that this is, they had a very, very difficult past and a very difficult memory during the Holocaust. Some had difficulties to recount emotions and experiences from the period of the Holocaust. This dynamic is reflected in the absence of the word Holocaust from the name of the project, among other things. As noted, the name of the project, Heritage from Revival to the Skies. So we see that we don't have the word Holocaust because some of them said that what helped me to recover was the rebirth, the revival to the skies. But after such in very deep research, I can say that their past was very difficult, and I emphasize the word Holocaust. Child survivors of Holocaust, the definition. Child survivors of the Holocaust are defined as children who were no older than 13 when the war began in 1939, or no older than 16 at the end of the war in 1945, and lived in occupied Europe during the war. Children of the Holocaust experienced three traumatic periods. Prior to the outbreak of the war in Germany from 1933 until 1939, and countries under occupation like Austria in 1938. A second period during the war itself, and the third after the war, and this period I call the war after the war. So, what memories emerged in the life stories of Air Force crew members who were children survivors of the Holocaust? About pre-war period, despite their young age and piosity of pre-war memories, several themes recur in the interviews. The economic situation, education, connection to religion and tradition, connection to Zionism, and relations with their non-Jewish neighbors, and relations with their parents. I can give an example for a memory of economic situation in Poland, in Warsaw, a child in Warsaw Ghetto. He spoke about a memory that remained in his mind to the present, about a gift that he received because of his parents' comfortable economic circumstances. For example, my parents came from a wealthy family. The strongest memory I have of home is a birthday party that they celebrated for me when I was 2 or 3 years old. I received a tricycle. I can say I have lots of examples, but time is short and I have to focus and proceed in war memories. War memories were very traumatic and formative, whether they survived on their own or with a family member. First war experience, yes, I can give an example. The opening event of my childhood during the Holocaust was horrific. The Germans came to my grandfather's house and beat my grandfather. I will never forget the picture of my grandfather laying on the wooden floor in a pool of blood mixed with jam. There were things like difficulties in separation from family and parents. Father as a leader, the challenges of survival, fear, hunger, cold, hiding places, sense of persecution, family and individual resourceless directed to survival. I found many people repeat efforts to live normal life during the Holocaust, despite of all the horrible time and difficulties. Holocaust experience were diverse due to the fact that the interviewees lived in different countries under Nazi occupation, as I mentioned before, and their experiences was a function of Nazi policy in each country. For example, they caught my uncle. I did not see how they killed him. I became an animal whose sole aim was survival, and there was nothing that I was not willing to do. I was a 6-year-old kid like an animal, stealing, pimping, plundering, lying, everything you can imagine. Another example, as early as 1943, we moved from place to place in the ghetto and hide in an empty cellar or hiding places that were prepared in advance. The most frightening thing was the sound of feet on the steps. It's the kind of thing that stays with you. In the war memories, they emphasize the mother's bravery. And every time I give the lecture, I feel that I'm doing historical justice to women, especially to mothers. Of course, fathers also were heroes. I don't want that somebody misunderstand me, but the mothers had to survive and to function as a mother and a father at the same time. The mothers that were not used to such duties, because the traditional mother, their role was different before the war. And during the war, they found themselves mothers and father at the same time. So, for example, I remember arriving in Auschwitz. They took us to the shower. They shaved our heads. This is the only situation that is branded in my memory that I won't ever forget. That is the moment. Head shorn with clothes. They left me my shoes. Those were the shoes that my mother had bought for me for 1 kilogram of rice. The most difficult thing was the shame and the humiliation. I will never forget it. And another example of mother's bravery. My mother managed to escape from the camp when she was 34 with a young boy. And then there was a horrific moment when a 14-year-old girl managed to crawl out the window and jumped from the train. At that awful moment, she shouted to my mother, "Throw him to me." My mother held me up and threw me out of the window. This person knows that his mother saved his life. But emotionally, until today, until the moment I interviewed him, he felt very sorry about this situation. He always thought in his mind, why my mother threw me away? He understood, of course, in his mind that she wanted to save him, but emotionally, it is until today very hard for him to accept it. So we can see a special group here that despite of the horrible memories, they become the elite. To become pilots, navigators in the Israeli Air Force, it's really elite of the elite. So what were the factors that helped them to become so? But we will come to the answer at the end of the lecture. So we proceed with examples of mother's bravery, the opposite example. My mother is a hero. She decided to give me away, to save me. My aunt is a hero. These two women, my mother and my aunt, saved their children. My mother was a strong, wise woman, yet she did not survive. Making the decision to give me away was an act of heroism. So now we see another example which he understands the child, which is now, of course, a grown-up person. He understands that his mother was a hero. To get such a decision to give away your child to save him, it's really a very heroic decision. So I have lots of examples about mothers, but you can read in the future the article which will be published in your university. It will be published in Polish language, so everyone can read it. Now it is in English, so if someone will want to read in English, I can send it. After the war, what happened? Then the war ended in 1945. The State of Israel was established in 1948. We have 3 years of difficulties. It's difficulties because this is a period of continuous challenges, coping with the post-war reality, facing with loss, facing with emptiness. Emptiness because no family, and to find out that there is no place to go back. Liberation Day was a significant memory at the most of the people I interviewed, because most of the people over Europe, over the world, were happy that the war ended. They were very sad because they found out that most of them survived alone. No family, no home, no place to go. The period of wandering until they immigrated to Israel, the different setting in which they were placed affected their decision or where they were put in Israel and the choice they made. The places that they were after the war put in Israel was a factor of meeting different setting during the time between 45 and 48. They describe the effect on their identity of the youth movement and Zionist ideology that they encountered immediately after the war and how they helped them cope with their Holocaust trauma. Despite the difficulties, the interviewees have a positive, vivid memory about the sights, taste, smells of this period. And this is very important to emphasize. Those who survived with their parents remember their parents' behavior and responses to the discovery of the terrible losses caused by the war and difficulties of coping with the new reality. On one hand, liberation, and on the other hand, being uprooted, loneliness, and homeless, and the knowledge that they have no home to return to. Sometimes these children were forced to part from their parents again when they arrived in Israel, because the first to come were children and they were separated from their parents, and the parents came some years after, so there was a gap between the children who already came to Israel and were integrated in the society with language, with the identity, and after some years the parents came, and the gap was difficult, you know, the gap was difficult to minimize. Those who survived without their parents found themselves completely alone and tried to fit into their new environment. So, immigration, the aliyah, it's a word in Hebrew that when you cannot translate it exactly, but we try to translate it as immigration to Israel. Immigration to Israel included many difficulties, such as new language, loneliness, problems adjusting to various new setting. The emotion tool of integrating into Israeli society included adoption of new identity and starting a new life. Still, for some, fundamental events such as the Eichmann trial affected their memories, and sometimes it reminds them the horror of the Holocaust. But most of them try to avoid memories and to start new beginnings. I registered for the first grade and they called me the refugee. The kids did not accept me. I didn't know the language. I did not fit and no one helped me. So we can see that I called this period the war after the war to become to integrate, to become one of the Israeli society, which was very difficult for them. Another example for difficulties to integrate. I remember I was always home alone, with no friends, without anything. My whole youth, I never wanted to remember the Holocaust. On the contrary, I wanted to forget it. I joined to the Tel Aviv Scouts. The aviation club became my home. I fit in very well. After Gadna, it's like a youth movement in schools in Israel. After Gadna, I went to the aviation club. We would go to Sde Dov. Sde Dov, it's a name of a small airport which now is not exist anymore, but most of the training of the beginning of the State of Israel pilot courses were in Sde Dov. So I would go to Sde Dov airfield every Saturday. So I would do anything so that people would not call me a refugee. There were many new immigrants in school. I invited the Sabra. Sabra again. Sabra, it's in Hebrew word for natives who were born in Israel. So when I finished flight school, I felt like a king, like the king of the world. Which were the factors that helped them to integrate? Two main factors helped them to integrate: kibbutzim and the Air Force. So what is kibbutzim? Kibbutzim is it's very Israeli way to, it's like collective settles, the people that live in a collective together. And now the kibbutzim were changed in Israeli society, but then to live in a kibbutz helped them to integrate. Why? Those days in the kibbutzim, all the children slept together. They did not sleep with their parents. And the children were raised together. So when the children who survived the Holocaust came to the kibbutzim, they slept with all the children and they went to parents who adopt them. there were some hours a day that they could see parents. So even the other children that were born in the kibbutzim went to their parents' home maybe for 2 hours a day, and the children who survived the Holocaust went to the parents who adopt them. So it helped them to integrate, to be like everyone. And also the children in the kibbutzim, they were dressed the same. So the refugees, the children from the Holocaust, they had a chance to assimilate very good with the children from the kibbutz. From their personal stories and interviewees, I learned that the kibbutzim, even it was difficult in the beginning, after that it helped them very much to integrate. So in the kibbutzim, they had the opportunity to shade the marks of the diaspora, and life on a kibbutz strengthened their ties to Israel. Life in the kibbutz sometimes encouraged them even to volunteer to the Air Force. So one factor I mentioned is the kibbutzim. The other factor is the Air Force, because the Air Force gave them the opportunity as changing from a humiliated child in the Holocaust to a child who belongs to the top elite of the state of Israel. So, what was the motivation for volunteering to the Air Force? Many of them emphasized that their Holocaust experience was influential in their decision to volunteer. For example, changing from humiliated child in the Holocaust to a child who belongs, as I mentioned before, to the top elite of the state of Israel. Maybe a brigadier general in the Air Force will grow out of the shame and humiliation of Auschwitz. If I manage to go from a yellow star of David on my chest to a blue star of David on my chest, then what more does a person need? Some of them was the desire, some of them mentioned that the factor that influenced to go and to volunteer to the Air Force was the desire to make a contribution and make a dream come true. Some of them mentioned that aviation club and the Air Gadna activities encouraged them to volunteer. Some said that youth movement encouraged them, and movement like HaShomer HaTzair was a formative experience that shaped his character. He said, my experience in the Shomer HaTzair shaped my character and my worldview of life and my desire to join to the Air Force and make a contribution. Some of them said that it was a way to integrate into Sabra society. When I was in flight school, I was not looking at my past. I was a Sabra. In the Air Force, I am already a Sabra. I was considered and judged according to my performance. Some of them said that living close to the Air Force base was a factor that motivated them. Some said it was a source of pride for their parents who survived, and some of them for their parents who did not survive. Some of them joined without a specific plan or intention. It was not meant to be. Some of them came, it was with not a specific desire, but most of them, or even all of them, shared a desire to protect the state and to make a contribution. I found reciprocal relation between their personal rebirth as children from the Holocaust and the Air Force. This is the reason why they call the project From Rebirth to the Skies. I found out appreciation and gratitude to the Air Force for its role in their personal revival. For example, during my 22 years of service in the Air Force, I served the country loyally with devotion, and at the same time I know that the country and the Air Force gave me much more than I gave them. And I'm coming to summary and conclusion. But before that, I would like to give more examples about the reciprocal relationship between the past, being a Holocaust survivor, child during the Holocaust, and the Air Force. What contributed to my personal rebirth was the state and the Air Force. Another example, I found out complete identification between men and the Air Force, which was expressed in phrase like, the Air Force is me, or I am the Air Force. The Air Force became their home and a source of conciliation for what they had lost in their childhood in the Holocaust, which increased their desire to contribute even more. The Air Force was a home and family for me. Another example, service in the Air Force shaped my new identity and marked a sharp transition from a passive victim to an active man in the Air Force. From my point of view, in the Holocaust, I was led everywhere. Here, I feel if I did something. All my life, I stayed in the Air Force because I wanted things. It was a passion. I wanted to be a fighter pilot in the war. So these are examples. And now for summary and conclusions. This study exposed the myth that the Air Force officers who served in the 50s and the 60s, the best to the skies, were Israeli-born natives, Sabra. Although they came from over there, from diaspora, from other countries, and survived the horrors of the Holocaust, they also completely identified with their mission as airmen and had the same passion for the Air Force and sense of mission as Israeli-born their partners. They so strongly identified with the Air Force that even their desire to come together as a group and tell the story of their past is based on their strong ties to the Air Force. Even today, the Air Force continues to offer a warm, supportive setting for this research project known as From Rebirth to the Skies. I am saying, after interviews, after analyzing so much, my statement is that their silence was a brick wall with intentional cracks. Their avoidance of discussions of their past and the new identities they built for themselves were major factors in their success. Yet, in certain situations, they were flooded by the memories and thought of their past. Despite the relatively disadvantageous starting point they had because of the circumstances of their childhood, they had a strong ambition to succeed. The glaring contrast between their difficult childhood and their notable successes as commander in the Air Force can be explained by the following factors. Their pride in playing a role in building and defending the state of Israel. The fact that the Air Force was their home and their family home, it enlarged their willingness to make a contribution and promote their successful integration in the Air Force and Israeli society. Their personal stories and the national stories are intertwined, representing the Holocaust and the national individual revival of all interviewees. The individual stories come together to create a complex description of the phenomenon. These life stories teach us about personal and collective memory, the dynamic of loss, wandering, return, and rebellion. In effect, their stories are it's a summary of some of the most important chapters in the Jewish history. The heritage of Holocaust survivors, air crew members, fighters, pilots, navigators, is an oral history that offers knowledge and insight to anyone interested in understanding their unique contribution to the Air Force and to the rebirth of the Jewish people in the State of Israel. I hope this study will become an important source of information to anyone interested in learning more about this topic.